Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Nick Iyengar. I'm an Associate Director of Digital Intelligence here at Cardinal Path, and I'm excited to take you through the Marketer's Guide to Tag Management Systems. What we're going to focus on today is how a tag management system or a TMS can really help you extract much more value from all that raw data that you're collecting from your site or even from your mobile apps. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started here. First thing is we are recording this session, so you'll get a copy of this via email probably tomorrow, so you can go back and refer to it. We'll also try to save plenty of time for some Q&A here at the end of the hour. So questions are absolutely more than welcome. I'd love to get any questions that you might have. Feel free to chat them in to the GoToWebinar chat console there. We're going to hold the questions to the end, but like I said, questions absolutely more than welcome, and hoping to have a good discussion there at the end during the Q&A time. And to help facilitate that Q&A, I'm joined by a couple of esteemed colleagues here. First, Nick Way, a consultant that I've worked with for a couple of years now, based out of our Vancouver office. And also, we're really privileged to have Mia Vallo with us today as well. She's the Senior Director of Marketing Analytics and Optimization at National Geographic, a long-term client of ours here at Cardinal Path, and really excited to hear kind of her real-world experiences with tag management to help us kind of cut through the noise, cut through the clutter, and hear about what it's like to migrate to a TMS in the real world. So we'll hear from Mia and Nick both a bit later. Again, I'm Nick Iyengar, Associate Director here at Cardinal Path in the DI practice, and I'll be leading us through a bunch of today's session. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we get into the meat of it, it's always helpful to kind of get a sense for where we all are in terms of kind of our usage of a TMS. And so in a second here, you're going to see a poll. It's going to let you kind of choose one of these options in terms of where you're at your organization in terms of your usage of a TMS. So we're curious, are you already using a TMS and you just want to kind of get the most out of it, further optimize it? Do you not have a TMS yet, but you're kind of starting to explore different vendors, starting to research them? Or are you pretty new to a TMS and are really here to kind of just learn the basics and learn how a TMS might be able to help you in the future? So you've got this poll up here. Go ahead and punch in the answer. I'm curious to see how this shapes up. All right, we've got good voter turnout here. About 75% of you have voted so far. We'll give it a couple more seconds. All right, and then a follow-up question. So we've got more than half of you that are not using a TMS yet. So we're curious to know, and this will help us actually kind of customize the presentation a little bit. You know, if you're not using a TMS, there may be multiple reasons for that, but if you can pick the one that sort of applies best to you. If you're not using a TMS, is it because you're already happy with how you're managing analytics as is? Kind of, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, that sort of thing. Or is it maybe you're not quite sure how a TMS could really benefit you? Are you concerned about having maybe a single point of failure for your tags? Or is it more that you're concerned about kind of the cost, either in terms of time, money, you know, duration, expertise, and so on. So again, if you don't have a TMS, really curious to know kind of what's driving that. All right, good. Lots of voting going on, and lots of different answers as well, which is really interesting. So let's go ahead and take a look at the results. So if we go back to the first question in terms of where we're at with the TMS, like I said, it looks like more than half of you are not using a TMS yet, and the bulk of those folks are sort of researching some of the different options that are out there. Now we'll talk a bit about the TMS landscape. There are lots of different offerings out there that really serve a variety of different needs and different types of organizations. So I think that'll be helpful for you. And a lot of you are here to kind of learn more about how to do more with the TMS that you're already using. So that's interesting as well. Some of you a little bit more on the newbie side, that's fine. We'll talk a bit about what the key benefits of a TMS are and why we think they're so important. But let's shift gears and drill a bit into those of you who aren't using a TMS and just talk a bit about what's going on there and maybe why that is. So what you see here, I thought this was pretty interesting. So it looks like, the single most common answer by quite a bit is that it's just not really clear what the benefits of a TMS are, right? So why go to all the effort if the benefits aren't clear, right? Some of you are saying you're happy with how you manage analytics already. Again, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I certainly subscribe to that theory, although I think there are reasons to migrate to a TMS, even if you are happy. And then a few of you are worried about kind of the single point of failure and the kind of the cost, again, in terms of money, but also just time, expertise, length of the project, that sort of stuff. So very interesting, but it seems like, the single biggest issue here is that the benefits may not really be clear. So we'll spend a good amount of time talking about what those benefits are and how, in my opinion, basically any organization can really benefit from adopting a TMS. So good stuff. Thank you all for voting. Like I said, it really actually helps understand the audience a bit more, and we can kind of dress this up or dress this down a bit to kind of fit the concerns that you have. But with that, let's go ahead and jump into it. So quick introduction to what the landscape looks like in terms of usage of TMSs. Some of you may have seen the research paper that I co-authored last year here at Cardinal Path. We looked at the IR 500, the Internet Retailer 500, which is the top 500 retailers. And we wanted to investigate usage of TMS within that segment. And we expected, given that these are generally speaking sort of large, mature organizations, that TMS usage would be virtually universal. But what you can see here is that that's actually not the case. In fact, almost half of those organizations, again, top 500 retailers, weren't using a TMS at all, and we were really surprised to find that. So much so, in fact, that we actually delayed putting out this report by quite a bit so that we could double and triple check our results just to make sure that we knew what we were talking about. And what I think is even more interesting than the quantity, the proportion of people not using a TMS, is if you look at just those organizations that aren't using a TMS, you find that a full third of them, right, so a third of the 42%, are actually managing multiple analytics solutions without a TMS in place. And so managing one analytics solution without a TMS can start to become complicated. Trying to manage more than one obviously only increases that complexity. So we thought that was really interesting, but I think one of the takeaways here is that, if you're not on a TMS, it doesn't mean that you're behind, right? It doesn't mean that you're a laggard in the industry by any stretch. In fact, barely half of these top 500 retailers, for example, are using a TMS at all. Now, in terms of which TMSs are most commonly used, I don't think anyone will be too surprised to see that Google Tag Manager, often referred to simply as GTM, I don't think anybody would be surprised that GTM is the single most commonly used TMS. A couple of sort of obvious reasons for that I'll just quickly review. One, of course, is that the market share of Google Analytics itself is so high, by far the most widely used analytics tool, and also because it's free. Now we'll talk a little bit about the 360 announcement that Google made earlier this month and what that means for GTM, but not too surprising, right? I don't think that GTM is the single most commonly used TMS. One of the interesting things that you note here, though, is that if you add up these numbers, they don't add up to 100% the way that you would expect in kind of a traditional market share analysis. And the reason for that is, as we just saw on the previous slide, not every retailer uses a TMS at all, but actually some retailers use more than one, which may sound counterintuitive, but there actually are good reasons to use more than one TMS in some environments. And so that's a quick look at kind of who's using a TMS and who's not, again, just in the IR top 500 as an example, and then what the TMS landscape tends to look like. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk a bit about sort of the benefits of tag management systems. Again, there's, I think, 63% of folks that are on this call who aren't using a TMS said they weren't sure how they'd benefit from a TMS. So this is my sort of artist's rendition of what managing analytics without a TMS looks like. You have a lot of different tools that require JavaScript tags that you deploy on your sites or on your app, and those range from kind of your standard clickstream web analytics tools like GA or Adobe Analytics. Maybe you're managing a DMP like a BlueKai or something similar. You've got your testing and optimization and personalization tools, Optimizely, Adobe, Target. I mean, there are so many more. You've got your various, ad serving platforms, social media sites, all those conversion pixels that you need to measure the performance of marketing campaigns. You've got survey, voice of customer tools, and I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, there's so many more tools and systems and vendors that you might be involved with, all of which require tags to be deployed on the site. And what happens is that without a tag management system, you essentially manage each of these tools through a one-to-one relationship with your site, right? So every single tool that you're using is sort of managed independently, managed directly, tags placed directly on the site. And what ends up happening is that you end up with what I call kind of the spaghetti situation, where tags are flying around everywhere, and not surprisingly, it becomes difficult to keep this organized, it becomes difficult to manage the logic of which tags fire when and why, where. You run into issues with tags that conflict with each other. Changes to the site can cause tags to be dropped from the site inadvertently. You then have to re-implement them. And so, one of the first things that a tag management system can do is sort of bring order to chaos, as I like to think of it. And so what a TMS does, and you can see this here, just kind of, again, visually representing this, a TMS gives you that kind of intermediary layer where you can deploy and edit and control the rules and logic and conditions about when all of these different tags from all of these different vendors and systems need to fire, right? And then from there, the TMS can deploy the tags out as needed to the appropriate place at the appropriate time. You end up actually executing a lot less code on your site, which has important implications that we'll talk about in a second. But you fire a lot fewer redundant tags, superfluous tags that don't need to be loaded, and you just have a much cleaner way to manage all this. So you get away from the spaghetti situation. So that, I think, even if you're not using a TMS, I think this is probably the benefit of a tag management system that most of us are, I guess, initially familiar with. Again, it's that intermediary layer that prevents you from having to manage all of these different vendors on that one-to-one basis with your site. Okay, but a TMS really isn't just about kind of an administrative or logistics tool to help you manage things a bit better or to get things organized for the sake of being organized. In fact, I think a TMS is very directly correlated with the actionability of the data that you collect in the first place. And so why is that? And to me, data is only valuable to the extent that it's actionable. I don't think that's a controversial point of view at this point. But what makes data actionable, right? To me, it's a couple of things. First, the data needs to be relevant to the stakeholders that are consuming the data. And second, the data needs to be trustworthy. So let's explore each of those a little bit in detail. In order to be relevant, you most likely are going to need to be able to support some degree of custom tagging, meaning that simply collecting kind of basic page view tracking from your site is probably not at this point in 2016 going to provide relevant data that really helps your stakeholders make decisions and take action. So some kind of support for custom tagging is becoming more and more important. On top of that, you need the ability to do custom tagging, but also to change that tagging and to evolve quickly. So as the needs of the business change, as you launch different kinds of marketing campaigns, as you onboard different vendors, as the website itself changes over time, you need the ability to react to that really quickly and not have holes in your data because you can't get the appropriate tags published in time. Right? So again, if you want data to be relevant, you need some of that custom tagging that a TMS really facilitates, as well as the ability to start moving a lot more quickly. But that's not it, right? Just having relevant data is it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And that's because data has to be trustworthy as well. I'm sure as I start talking about this, I'm going to see a lot of, or virtually see a lot of knowing glances around the room here, but we all know what happens here, right? When the data isn't reliable, right? When you start to have unexplained spikes or dips in various metrics, whether it's your traffic or your bounce rate or your conversions or whatever it is, even if those kind of things can be fixed relatively quickly, we all know that that tends to undermine trust in data, especially amongst the people who don't know quite as much about how the analytics package works in the first place, right? What those stakeholders see is charts that have interruptions in them, that have all kinds of annotations scribbled in there like, oh, don't worry about this, the bounce rate was messed up for 2 days, not a big deal. Easy for us to say, right? But we know that that undermines confidence in the data. But it's not just enough to have reliable data, right? We don't want to have those gaps, those spikes, and those dips. We need it to be reliable, but we also need, and I think this is kind of the, in my opinion, the kind of underappreciated point in the industry is we need there to be some transparency in terms of how that data is produced in the first place. So we need to let all of our stakeholders have a window into the supply chain, so to speak, of how this data populates into the reports from the site or the app itself. So again, if you want data to be actionable, it needs to be relevant, it needs to be trustworthy. What we're going to see here over the next few minutes is that deploying a TMS actually helps you make progress against each of these four kind of key buckets or four key areas that you see here. So the ability to do custom tagging, the ability to evolve that tagging quickly and easily, better reliability, and also better transparency and engagement in terms of how the data is being produced in the first place. So let's dive into that. Again, the first kind of key benefit is the agility and the speed with which you can deploy tags, again, as your marketing campaigns change, as the site changes. But one of the things that we often forget is that it's not just about the speed of tag deployment itself, it's about the speed of the site as well. And so, I went in and pulled some client data, and I can't share which client this is, but it doesn't matter. I could have pulled this data from virtually any of our clients. What we all know, even without seeing the data, is that there is absolutely a relationship between the load time of the site and conversion performance on the site. And so what you're seeing in this chart here is that as load time increases, conversion performance tends to deteriorate. And I'm sure that virtually everyone who's listening in right now could pull very similar data from their own site. So it's not just about the speed with which you can deploy tags, it's also about the speed of your site. Speed of the site will improve because now you're not running superfluous tags when they aren't needed. You're reducing duplicate tags. You're minifying your JavaScript a lot better. You're just running a lot leaner, right? And that has a lot of implications, right? Both on the user experience side, which you're seeing here in terms of conversion rate. But for example, it has a lot of SEO implications as well. We know that the big search engines like Google are paying more and more attention to the load time of your site, and are ranking your sites accordingly, right? So a TMS can help you, again, both to deploy tags faster, but also to improve the speed of the site itself. So that's a big one. Next one is the reliability. And so what you have here is, again, if you go back to the spaghetti view of things, when you're managing all of your tools on a one-to-one basis with the site, you just have a much higher likelihood of those tags conflicting with each other, of changes to the front end of the site causing tags to fail, tags to be dropped from the site inadvertently. That means that you then have to reinstall those tags. Without a TMS, that reinstallation takes longer than it really should. And so by adopting a TMS, you put yourself in a situation where you don't have those kind of spikes in your bounce rate or dips in page views on important parts of your site. All those things that erode confidence of your stakeholders in the data that they're receiving, right? So improved reliability is a big deal on top of the speed with which you can evolve your tagging. Okay, and then the next one, we talked about this a little bit already, but it's not just about having the data be relevant, it's having it be trustworthy as well. And so when you have a TMS, it's much easier to define and enforce some clear governance in terms of what the process for tag deployment should be, right? So who is able to edit a tag? Who is able to do the QA and finally push it into production? Who does that? What's the schedule? So on and so forth. Even if you're not the person that ends up ultimately pushing the big red button, so to speak, you have a window now into how that process works and you're able to contribute to it. What that means is you get better engagement from across the organization, right? So there are a lot of stakeholders that have, or at least should have, a bit of a say in terms of how this tagging works, right? Marketing obviously would be the obvious choice, but IT, even legal, privacy, your agency partners that you may be working with. With the TMS, all of those stakeholders now have kind of a window into the supply chain of how this data gets produced. For example, it's much easier for marketers to be able to go to IT and say, hey, when someone clicks on this button, I want an eventifier, and I want that event to be formatted this way and to show up, with this language in the report so that it's, friendly for the people who are consuming the data, et cetera, et cetera. And so one is you have better reliability through better governance, but you also have better engagement because all of your stakeholders now feel like they're kind of invested in the process that produces this data in the first place, right? So again, that window into the process that everyone feels like they can contribute leads to much better faith and confidence in the data that's being produced. Okay, and then lastly, this is sort of a classic benefit of a TMS, and this can mean different things to different organizations, but every hour that IT is not spending helping marketing make sure that sort of conversion pixels are in the right place and that sort of stuff is time that they can be spending focusing on the things that really only they can be doing at the organization. And so whether that's working on making the site faster, safer, more secure, building or acquiring new capabilities for the organization, whatever it might be, those kind of higher level strategic initiatives that IT really needs to be working on instead of helping you put that AdWords conversion pixel on your site, right? They now have that much more time to spend on those kind of things. So that's kind of a high level view of what the benefits of a TMS are. Again, I think all of these things roll up toward making your data more actionable, which means that you're able to capture much more value out of the data that you're collecting. So I'm doing a lot of talking here. I think what you really want to hear is how this looks in the real world. So with that, let me turn it over to our special guest, Mia Vallo from National Geographic. So take it away, Mia.
Thanks, Nick. Hello, everyone. My name is Mia Vallo, and I'm the Senior Director of Marketing Analytics and Optimization at National Geographic Partners. In case you're not familiar with Nat Geo, we have magazines, TV channels, travel expeditions, an online store, live events, a museum, and of course, the nonprofit arm, National Geographic Society. So as you can guess from that list, we do have several sites, and we do use different CMSs or content management systems on our sites. And knowing that, it was just really hard to get something updated on our site, whether it's just a simple marketing or remarketing tag, since we have to go in not just one queue for technology to get something deployed as simple as a one-line tag, but multiple queues because we have different development teams or technology teams handling each CMS. So, sometimes it could take just months to get a marketing pixel up on our site. Because of this, we launched a tag management system on our site a few years ago, and our team really pushed to make this happen because we wanted to have one, as I mentioned before, have better control and faster implementation of marketing and analytics tags on our site to really clean up old tags that we no longer use. National Geographic itself has been around since 1888. The website obviously hasn't been around that long, but it's been around long enough to have just tags that have been abandoned or really old tags that we don't need anymore. 3, have an easier and better way to maintain the new tags moving forward. So we went through a vendor review for tag management system, and at the selected Google Tag Manager on our site. And the reason for that is we're already using Google Analytics on our site. We do have other analytics tools, but for content and marketing, we use primarily Google Analytics. We also use DoubleClick for Publisher or DFP for ads on our site. And then some of our marketing teams are already using DoubleClick Campaign Manager. I think in the past it used to be called DFA or DoubleClick for advertisers. So for us, it makes the most sense to use Google Tag Manager on our site. We did take a look at other vendors, as I mentioned before, and Google Tag Manager is definitely great to, have your basket of tags, and there are definitely other benefits for the other tags as well. The other tag management systems as well, but in this case, this one works for us. In addition, we also migrated to Google Analytics Universal last year, and we took that opportunity again to clean up the analytics tags on our site. And we've definitely seen, yeah.
If I could just interrupt for 1 second. So it sounds like what you were saying is that when you looked at other tag management systems aside from GTM, I guess one of the things that stood out to you was that you're already pretty invested in kind of the Google stack, so to speak, right? You're already using GA. Right. You're using DoubleClick, which for those of you who don't know is also a Google tool. So is that kind of what pushed you over the edge then toward GTM?
Yes, that and also the costs.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay. Well, we'll talk a bit more about some of the other TMSs that are out there as well, and I may want to pick your brain just a little bit more when we get there, Mia, about kind of why you looked at some of the other systems and maybe what you liked about them. But anyway, sorry to interrupt. I'll let you keep rolling.
No
here.
worries. Okay, sure. And so we've definitely seen a lot of benefits from implementing a tag management system on our site. For example, one, there's just a huge decrease in our time to deploy tags. As I mentioned before, we had to wait in multiple queues for the multiple CMSs. If, let's say, we want to run a remarketing pixel across all of our pages for a marketing campaign. So it could be up and running in a particular CMS in 2 days because their technology team is faster versus another site which may take up to a few months. So because of this, we are now less reliant on our developers in terms of getting tags up and running. We do still have our developers and our QA team involved whenever we deploy something on the tag management system, but it definitely has cut down in terms of the tickets that we have submitted to technology. Again, going from getting something deployed from as many as a few months to just as few as the same day or maybe 2 days. So we were also able to reduce the number of tags deployed by cleaning up what we don't need before, as I mentioned before. And we do work with Nick and team at Cardinal to manage Google Tag Manager and also to manage our analytics implementation in general. So it helps a lot to have a system or platform that they can easily access to manage the tags for us. And in terms of lessons learned and also best practices, I think I'll start with lessons learned first. Definitely, communication. So before we actually deployed just a tag management system on our site, we sat down with our technology team, specifically our web operations team, to make sure that they are on board on it, to address any concerns that they have. They were involved also in terms of the vendor selection and then the vendor reviews for the tag management systems before we decided on Google Tag Manager. And then after we have Google Tag Manager, really finding that communication is key, not just before the tag is deployed, but after the tag is deployed. So in our case, we treat it as if it's just a regular deployment on our site. So we involve QA, we involve other teams who may need to know about it. I guess just because you have the ability and you have the access to publish the tags or whatever you want on the site, it doesn't mean that you should. So going back to treating it as a deployment on our site, we're not restricted to specific sprint schedule, so it's definitely a much more flexible timeline. We typically give our QA team a heads up, say, hey, we're working on this, just so you know, it should be coming, to you in the next few days. So they actually created a special queue for us, just so we can submit a ticket formally to them saying, hey, this is what we're going to have, this is what's going to be launching on the tag management. So we definitely made the mistake of, in the beginning of having that access to deploy pretty much whatever tags we need on our site without letting the QA team know. And it was definitely a painful process for both our team, the QA team, and many other people who touched the website. So that's just a huge lesson learned on our side. And then still on communication is also communication among the people who actually use the tag management system. So for example, really important to label the tags, the triggers or the rules correctly, the different versions that you have, just so you understand exactly what changed in that particular version. And then if there is still a problem, even after going through QA, we can go back and say, okay, this version is the cause of it because of whatever change it is. So let's revert to the previous version. And also, if I need to log into GTM and let's say, my team members are out of the office, I can easily see what the latest version has, and there's no confusion on that. Another lesson learned is, just consolidate as needed. It's Google Tag Management is, I'm not technical, but to me, it's still pretty user-friendly. And it was easy to create tags. It was easy to create the triggers. So I think we were kind of, tag and trigger happy. And then we just had duplicate triggers and rules for the tags. We're much better now in reusing the triggers for the tags that we have, but definitely a lesson learned is just consolidate as needed. And just the final lesson learned is that not all tags will work on the tag management system. Just wanted to be open about that because ideally, if it's a tag for marketing and we just want to get that deployed as soon as possible, we should deploy it via the tag management system. But then there are times when, for whatever reason, that it doesn't work using the tag management system. So typically, we will always try to use the tag management system first. And then very rarely, if it doesn't work, then we'll work through our regular queue with the development team. So from that, we've learned in terms of the best practices, and these are the best practices that have worked for us for implementation. One, as I mentioned before, get IT to be on board first before deploying. So we've agreed on a process of what happens if we have a tag that we need to deploy on the tag management system. And now our technology team actually refers other teams to get a tag deployed via the tag management system first before they actually try to hard code the tag and see if that's something that we can do and help them out with because of the faster turnaround. Also, another best practice is establishing a process with developers and QA. We actually sent a few of our developers to be trained on using Google Tag Manager because even though we do work with Cardinal Path really closely in managing the tags in Google Tag Manager, there are times when we need to have our developers go in there. And it's just a good, not just technical development for them to have, but it's also good for a buy-in from the technology point of view if you're trying to get a buy-in from your own technology team, because then they're familiar with the tool. There are less concerns in terms of things that we are deploying via the tag management system. And then finally, as I mentioned before, just because you can deploy it yourself, it doesn't mean that you should. So always involve QA and other teams that you need.
Yeah, Mia, I think that's, I think through all the lessons learned, the one that really stuck out to me was exactly that, right? The sort of one of the appeals of a TMS is that it lets your team have that kind of freedom, right, to deploy tags a lot more quickly, and potentially with a bit less oversight, right? And so that kind of freedom is sort of a double-edged sword, right? You can move a lot more quickly, but it's good to have. I think what I was hearing come through in a lot of that is process, right? There needs to be kind of clear, documented process that people are following, so that the freedom that you get being able to deploy tags so quickly doesn't turn into a mess, right?
Yep, exactly.
Cool. All right. Well, let's run through a few kind of considerations that I think marketers should keep top of mind, especially those of you that are thinking about migrating to a TMS in the future. So we'll go through some business considerations, and then I'm going to hand it over to Nick Way to talk us through some of the technical considerations that are commonly coming up as well. So first thing that I think it's really important to think about is when is the right time to migrate to a TMS. So if you're listening in here today and you're kind of the internal champion for a tag management system within your organization, it may be tempting to kind of go in with guns blazing and start pitching everyone inside your company that you guys need to have a TMS and you need to have it set up by Monday morning. And I'm exaggerating a little bit there, but there is kind of a good time to migrate to a TMS, and a couple common scenarios come to mind. One is if you have a site redesign in the works already, right? The incremental amount of effort that migrating to a TMS represents is pretty small relative to doing a whole site overhaul, right? So that's a good time to do it. Also, if you're considering shifting the analytics tool that you're using, right? So if you're moving from GA to Adobe or vice versa, obviously, that can be a good time to adopt a TMS as well. Conversely, we've seen some kind of negative experiences with our own clients where sometimes clients want to migrate to a TMS immediately after doing a big project like one of those that I just mentioned, and oftentimes you get a bit of pushback internally, right? Because there's sort of analytics fatigue that comes with doing a site redesign or doing a tool implementation, and so you may want to just think a bit about picking your spots, right? Is it sort of politically the right time, or is it not? Something to keep in mind in terms of getting buy-in across the rest of the organization. Another question that comes up a lot, and I have to say there's really not one right answer to this, is who owns the TMS in terms of the day-to-day operation of it once it's in place? Should it be IT? Should it be marketing? We often think about IT versus marketing as if there's sort of this dichotomy where marketing is purely non-technical, but of course that's not always the case, right? And so the answer to this question really depends on your organization. I think what's key to keep in mind is that despite what you may hear from the various TMS providers about kind of what they let marketing do and how independent they can be of IT, there absolutely is still some technical oversight needed. So keep that in mind. But if your marketing staff is more on the technical side, they understand JavaScript, they can write a bit of code, they certainly can be much more self-sufficient. But I encourage you to think about, regardless of who owns the TMS, what the process should look like, what the communication should be, and so on, because that's, as you heard from Mia, really critical to making a TMS work really, really smoothly. Okay, next, how do I ensure that migrating to a TMS doesn't create issues with what's already working? This is a really interesting question and one that can weigh on the minds of people, especially if you're working in an organization that has a fairly complex analytics environment already. The analogy that I would offer you here is it's almost like moving, right? When you move, as stressful as that can be, it's a great opportunity to kind of get rid of stuff that you're not using, right? All that stuff is in the back of your closet that you really should take down to Goodwill. Those are kind of like all those extra tags that were on Nat Geo, right? That they didn't need anymore, that they could kind of clean up. So it's a great time to get rid of excess baggage from a tag standpoint. But at the same time, you don't want to lose anything that's really important. So it is really critical that you take kind of an inventory of your analytics environment and make sure that as you migrate to a TMS, you're not losing anything that your stakeholders are actually using, right? So that's a big deal. The other thing to keep in mind is that the longer you wait to migrate to a TMS and the more complex your analytics situation gets, the more difficult and more complex it will be to eventually make that migration at some point in the future. And so while there is sort of a right time to move to a TMS, as we talked about a minute ago, I have to say I do feel pretty strongly that that sooner is better, right? The longer you go without making the jump, the harder it gets to kind of pull the Band-Aid off, so to speak. And sort of last, or not lastly, but what's the level of effort to migrate to a TMS? This is an interesting question as well. Oftentimes, part of the sales pitch, and this is just true of, in my opinion, a lot of the different TMS vendors, is that you can get up and running really quickly. It's pretty seamless, and certainly, that can be true. But keep in mind, if you're a global enterprise, if you've got multiple brands, if you operate in many geographies around the world, this probably isn't the kind of thing that you're going to get done. You're not going to go from 0 to 60 in a month. I would say, if you're that kind of business, you should plan for at least a quarter, maybe more, to get a TMS sort of fully deployed. So keep that in mind. The price range can vary a lot, but just from a time standpoint, I would say, if you're a global enterprise, I would say you should budget a quarter, and that's probably on the optimistic side, maybe even a little bit more than that to be safe. In terms of price range, of course, there's a variety of offerings out there in the market. We'll talk about this a bit more. But one other consideration kind of on the business side is, which of the TMSs that are out there, whether it's GTM or Adobe's DTM, Dynamic Tag Manager, or one of the kind of vendor neutral offerings like Insight or Telium or Signal, which of these TMSs best supports and integrates the sort of marketing technology stack, so to speak, that you've already invested in, right? So you're using certain tools that are really critical to your business, which of these TMSs sort of best and most seamlessly supports those tools. So those are some business considerations, and as you can see, for a lot of these, it's not that there's necessarily a right or wrong way to do it, but it's just really important to think through these kind of things before you make decisions about potentially which TMS is right for you. So with that, I want to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Nick Way. Nick's one of our technical consultants out of our Vancouver office. One of my favorite folks to work with. I've enjoyed working with him over the last couple of years, especially on a couple of TMS implementations. And yeah, I really wanted to get Nick involved here so that he could kind of give us a window into some of the more technical considerations that come with sort of the TMS migration process as well. So Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll go ahead and take a look at some of these technical considerations.
Thanks, Nick. So as an implementation consultant, one of the things that I primarily do is work with clients to implement a tracking schema on their site, an analytics program, if you will. And typically that involves taking a business requirements document and a measurement framework that the client has worked on with one of our analysts, and sort of converting that into a tracking schema and ultimately implementing that through a TMS. So throughout this process, I do get a lot of questions from clients, both the people that I deal with directly, which would be typically marketers or analysts, but also, IT folks as well. So that's what I'd like to help out with today, and also answer any other questions that might come up in chat later on. So the first question that we always get is, won't the tag manager slow down my site? And although it's true that the TMS itself is another piece of JavaScript that needs to be downloaded and executed to your browser, they're typically optimized in a way for maximum speed and minimum impact on your site. The actual impact or the actual overhead that they encompass is actually really small because they use techniques like content delivery networks to speed delivery of code to your site, and they make sure that all the tags are firing in a non-blocking or asynchronous manner. And actually what you end up finding is that because of these gains, they actually offset the overhead that accompanies firing these tags in sort of a manual or conventional method, and you actually see that your site speed should improve. It is important to note, though, that a lot of TMSs allow you to inject custom JavaScript code that you write yourself, and there's certainly the opportunity there that if code is not properly tested or poorly written, that it will impact site speed or even break certain pages. The next question that I get is just in how difficult it is to actually install the tag manager. The base code installation is actually very simple. It's typically a code snippet that you just drop into a consistent place on each and every page, and that will vary from vendor to vendor. But the reality of the situation is that for anything more than the simplest of tags, you will require some developer help to surface additional data points or make minor adjustments to pages so that the tag manager can actually access that data. The next question that we typically deal with is how, sorry, are we on the right slide, Nick?
Sorry about that. I have a little bit of lag. Are you?
There it is, yeah. How do we feed data into our TMS? And there are three primary methods. So the most basic method is that in general, anything that you can actually see on the page or anything that's invisibly available on the page in the form of hidden markup or metadata is actually available to the TMS through page scraping. But of course, that has its limitations. So the second technique is sort of to get a developer to help you surface additional data through the addition of HTML classes and IDs or inserting metadata attributes on specific elements on the page. And the third primary method of getting data is to use real-time data pushes. So classic examples of this would be, if you needed to track clicks on a particular button or adding items to your cart if you're an e-commerce site. These sorts of things need to be pushed to the data layer, which I'll explain in a second, sort of in a real-time manner so that the tag manager is aware that the event occurred and can fire the appropriate tags. What the data layer is it's sort of a more advanced technique, but it's definitely the preferred approach, which is to use a designated JavaScript object that sort of warehouses data that your tag manager will leverage to fire certain tags. And this is certainly the approach that we try to take with, in our daily practice with clients. And it just avoids situations where excuse me, a change on page unexpectedly, a design change, for instance, in the menu or whatever, unexpectedly results in breakage of tag or just complete non-firing of tags. The last point that I have is just in terms of, it sort of answers that same question that I know Nick brought up as one of his last points is, will I actually be able to do everything myself after it's installed? And sort of the answer to that is along the lines of my the answer to the last question, which is that if you look at how much developer involvement there is with pushing specific custom data, you'll see that you're not sort of on an island. And you can't just do things yourself. There will be cases where you need to have custom data surfaced by a developer. There are also other reasons that you will need to lean on other folks. So for instance, even though a piece of data may be on the page and you could get it that way, it might not be the optimal way to get it, and it might just be better to get that, for instance, from the data layer instead. You also want to make sure that you've got a robust development and QA procedure in place, and that was one of the lessons learned that Mia mentioned. And you also want to make sure that your schedules are in sync with with the web development team and with other teams as well, in terms of campaigns that are being pushed out, in terms of new features that are being released. You just want to make sure that you have that lead time, so that if you're releasing a new tag, it doesn't break some existing site feature, or vice versa. You could have the web development team adding something that unexpectedly breaks something on your side. And so definitely that communication is part of this. And so from that standpoint, you're never going to be completely free from processing as you shouldn't be. And sort of the last point with that is that in general, you probably want to have again, some process or some people to double check your work for you, especially if you are working with custom JavaScript tags. If you're working with built-in tags, there's very little risk of anything going wrong. But anytime that you're touching JavaScript, especially if it's not really your core expertise, it definitely helps to have somebody with that knowledge to just double check for you that everything is firing as expected and it's not breaking something else on the page. I think that's all the
good points, Nick. Yeah, we wouldn't want to alienate the developers in the room, so I'm glad you can keep our expectations in check there about whether we can live without you once we have a TMS. It's good to keep our feet on the ground a little bit. All right, well, I want to get into everyone's questions. We've got actually, wow, quite a few that have come in, so that's exciting. We'll make a couple quick points here in terms of kind of the vendor landscape, right? So there are a lot of TMSs that are out there. There are more than just the ones that I'm showing here on the slide, but these are probably the most common ones. So GTM, obviously, by far the most common, but again, not right for everyone. So just wanted to give kind of a quick overview of kind of these different tools. I think at a high level, you can look at these through sort of two lenses. One is you've got sort of Adobe and Google, right? And these are the tools that, at least in theory, they go hand in hand with the appropriate or with the respective analytics platform, right? So you've got Adobe Analytics, you've got Google Analytics, and a lot of people often say, well, if I'm using Google Analytics, why would I look further than GTM? And as you heard from Mia, in their case at Nat Geo, GTM did make the most sense, and yet they still considered other options. Similarly, if you're an Adobe house, right? I'm using Adobe Analytics, why would I look further than GTM? But actually there are good reasons, especially at sort of the enterprise level, to consider some of the other TMSs that are out there, the Teliums, the Insightons, the Signals, and like I said, there are even more that are on the slide here. So we're not going to get into the weeds here in terms of, which tool has which feature, but, high level, there's some things to think about here. If, for example, you're in certain industries that have certain sort of regulatory constraints around privacy of your data, security of your data, a lot of the sort of analytics vendor agnostic platforms, meaning the ones other than Adobe and Google, are invested fairly heavily kind of in that kind of robust feature set around data privacy and data security. That's something to think about. Also, if you want to have more kind of complex permissions around who can access which tags, who can edit which tags, setting up different workflows that different people have access to, and so on and so forth, just better ability to kind of compartmentalize your TMS and let people only touch the pieces that they should be. That's also an area, kind of generally speaking, where the other players tend to excel. So, I just want to make sure that people are aware that just because you're using GA or just because you're using Adobe doesn't mean that you should sort of plow ahead with their TMS without considering other options, because again, depending on the industry that you're in, some of the privacy, security, permissions, sort of administrative needs that you might have, other kind of advanced features that are out there, you may well want to consider some of the other TMSs that are out there. And oftentimes we see a lot of folks kind of assuming that they should use GTM or a DTM just because they're using that company's analytics platform. So, at CP we have clients on each and every one of these TMSs, and oftentimes they're not just the ones that belong to their analytics platform, right? So we've got clients that use GA who are not using GTM. We've got clients using Adobe who aren't using DTM, and I just want to make sure everyone is aware that you ought to do your due diligence into these offerings, because they really do have a lot to offer. Okay, so in terms of next steps, again, I want to jump into the questions. First thing you ought to do if you're considering moving to a TMS is assemble a posse, as I put it, or put together your team. Too often we see that the TMS kind of selection process is driven kind of within a silo in an organization, like marketing is doing it by themselves or IT is doing it. But what I recommend is, again, put together that team. Marketing should be involved for sure. IT should be involved for sure. You may want to get legal or privacy involved, and then one that's really commonly overlooked is get your agency partners involved as well, right? So if you've got media agencies doing your ad serving and doing your creative and all that kind of stuff, they're going to have a point of view on a TMS as well, so get their input. And then once you've got that team assembled, jointly develop the TMS selection criteria, right? You can imagine that if IT is doing this by itself, or if marketing is doing it by itself, the selection criteria that you use to choose a TMS could look really different, right? And so you want to get that diversity of perspective, make sure that everyone's needs are being heard, everyone's point of view is being taken into account. A lot of different selection criteria that you can and should use, but again, really important to jointly develop that list of criteria. And then once you've done that, it's also important to figure out whether you can manage the implementation of a TMS in-house, right, internally or not. And I think a good litmus test for that is, can you manage your analytics deployment even before you have a TMS? Can you manage that in-house, or are you using a partner for that? So that's something to keep in mind as well. You don't want to get kind of halfway down the process and then have to sort of stop and realize that you need a partner to support you. So that's something to think about as well. So let's open it up to questions. We've got about 5 minutes here, and we do have a bunch of questions. So I'll try to I'll be the traffic cop here. So Mia and Nick, I'm gonna farm out some questions for you, and I'll try to address the ones that are sort of the most broadly applicable first, and then we'll work our way down from there. So Nick, you're the lucky winner. I think you're going to get the first question here. This is a really good one too. Can you maybe just sort of give an overview of some of the big differences that you've seen in the different TMSs that you've worked with?
Sure. One of the nice things, I primarily deal with GTM in my daily work, but I have worked with Telium and Insighten and maybe another one or two as well. One of the nice things about GTM is how approachable it is. The interface is very clean, and it's easy to locate things. But there are some advanced features that are sort of, I would say, a little bit better in other TMSs. For instance, with Telium and Insighten, there's a more robust environment management system. You can deploy tags to your QA environment, so your development environment while you're working on things, and then you can push those and promote those to QA for testing, and then finally to production. GTM doesn't really have a robust system for that. That would be one key difference. Another key difference is just in terms of load rules. So for instance, Telium has a neat feature where it basically lets you design not only what triggers an event, but when that code will even load. And so the nice part of that is that you're not loading a bunch of superfluous code on a page where a tag will never fire. And IT folks love that, because that means just, any time that there's less page weight, the site's going to perform better. I'm just trying to think of other things. In general, in terms of the commonalities, though, they all sort of have a concept of a data layer, and so the important thing is to not be scared by the fact that if you during that selection process, if you need to move from one to another, if you've built the data layer in a way that structurally makes sense, you're not sort of locked in because of that. You do have the opportunity to, the data layer is sort of a common language that all of these systems speak. So, you're not by any means locked in, at least from that standpoint, in doing an implementation. The tags, yes, but the data layer will always be the same across.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, thanks, Nick. All right, I'll take this next one because a few people have actually asked the same question, but Mia, fair warning, the next one's coming for you. So a couple of folks have asked, do you know anything or can you comment on kind of the new Google Tag Manager 360, which is part of the larger kind of 360 suite announcement that Google made earlier this month? So that's a fabulous question. To be honest, there isn't that much to say about GTM 360 just yet. The biggest difference is that Google is now kind of formally supporting Google Tag Manager with an SLA, which is a service level agreement, and with the same level of customer support that you would be getting if you were a Google Analytics premium customer. That said, I think it's very early days, right? I mean, this was just announced a couple of weeks ago, and what I would expect to see, and it's important to note that I'm speculating here. This is not insider knowledge or anything. But what I would expect to see over the coming months and years is that there will probably start to be a bit of a divergence between GTM 360 and kind of regular GTM from a feature standpoint. So potentially some of those things that Nick was talking about that some of the other tools have that GTM doesn't. You may start to see those things appear in a GTM 360 before they do in kind of regular GTM. Again, that's my kind of speculation, but that's certainly what we've seen in the Google Analytics world, right, between GA Premium and GA. So that's about it in terms of GTM 360 for now, but of course it's certainly a space to watch, and we'll be hearing a lot more from Google about this as time goes on. But Mia, let me toss one over to you because there's a good question here kind of speaking to your experience at National Geographic. One of the points that you made was how much you were able to kind of clean up your tags, and I think you said we went from something like 1,000 different tags to about 500. Can you just give a bit more detail about sort of what that means to clean up tags, or why were you able to get rid of so many tags?
Sure. I guess the tags are both on the pages themselves and then also on the tag management system. And, they were just some old tags that were just left there because maybe it was for a particular marketing campaign, and then when a campaign is done, that marketing team never asked the technology team to take it off. Within tag management system, we definitely do like an audit periodically just to see, hey, which tags should we still keep, which tags we don't keep anymore. So in that case, that helps a lot in terms of cleaning up the tags. But then there were also other tags, not just for marketing, but let's say if it's for a survey or some other analytics tools that perhaps a partner has requested to place on our site. So these are the things that we may not need anymore, or we may not even want to have it on our pages. So those are the things that we also clean up.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool. Well, we're almost at time, so let me just rattle off one more answer to one more question because it's a pretty quick one. We did get a lot of questions that we weren't able to answer here live in the session, but Nick and I will both be following up after the fact to answer the ones that we couldn't get to live, and we'll post these to our blog. So a lot of good questions here about the data layer and a variety of other things. We're absolutely going to get to those, so if you didn't get your question answered here live, don't worry. We'll absolutely give you some insights on those. But one question came in is, what are some reasons that you might be using more than one TMS platform, right? Kind of an interesting scenario. Why would you need more than one? And the most common reason that I've seen is as follows. If you have a variety of different agencies managing different aspects of your business for you, for example, if you've got an agency managing analytics, you've got an agency managing paid media, you've got an agency managing social, whatever the case might be, you may actually use one TMS to load another TMS that agency needs to use for one reason or another. And so you almost get this kind of Russian doll situation where you've got TMSs within TMSs. Now that's admittedly a little bit of an edge case, but certainly can happen, especially at the enterprise level. And again, I think the biggest driver of that is different agencies just may have really specific requirements in terms of what they need to be executing, and sometimes that means that they're actually using different TMSs. All right, well, like I said, we're at time. If we didn't get to your question live here during the session, I encourage you to check out our blog over the next day or two. We'll be tweeting out links and that sort of stuff, so you can see all the follow-up. But a lot of good questions here, very much well worth answering. So we'll be doing that. I just want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank Nick and especially Mia for making time to share your experience with us. I think it's been really valuable for all the folks who are listening in. So thanks to Nick, thanks to Mia, and thank you all for attending.